Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I want to take a few minutes and I want to talk a little bit about biomes with you. So, biomes is in the current section that we're doing on the living world. I'm sure that you covered in biology, so it's not completely new to you, so we ought to be able to go rather quickly. I want to relate it back, though, to some things that we talked about earlier in the year. So, when we're talking about biomes, we're talking about large sections of the earth that have a similar climate. And the key thing that really determines the type of biome is the climate, and that determines the type of plant life. So we're going to be able to distinguish the different types of biomes by looking at the different types of, talk about several biomes that are forests. Of course, in forests, the dominant plant life is some type of tree. We'll talk about several biomes that are grasslands, where the dominant plant life is grass. We'll also look at a biome where the dominant plant life is shrubs. And you'll see a number of biomes that you should be familiar with from before. Now, what I was really trying to get at, though, was that what determines the dominant plant life is the climate. And with the climate, we're going to be looking at two things, the temperature and the rainfall. Two most important things to understand with the climate. Now, I want to relate both of those back to atmospheric circulation patterns. So if you look up here, you see a picture of the globe. Earlier in the year, we talked about the principal lines of latitude. So the equator cuts the earth in half, north to south. The Tropic of Cancer is the furthest north where the sun's ever directly overhead. For us, it's directly over the Tropic of Cancer on the first day of summer, the summer solstice. The Arctic Circle, it's the line in the northern hemisphere for where at least one 24-hour period, the sun does not rise, and for another 24-hour period, the sun does not set. Go into the south, you have similar lines of latitude, the Tropic of Capricorn, the farther south where the sun's ever directly overhead. For us, it is directly over the tropic. When it's directly over the Tropic of Capricorn, it's the first day of winter. And the Antarctic Circle, where again, for one 24-hour period, the sun does not rise, and for another 24-hour period, the sun does not set. Now, when we were talking about these lines of latitude, we talked about, depending on the tilt of the earth, the sun's rays hit at different angles. And they usually hit most directly around the equator. So because the sun's rays hit most directly around the equator tends to be warm, and it tends to be warm all year round. And when the ground or the water is warm, that makes the air be warm. And when the air is warm, that hot air rises. So we talk about typically near the equator, the hot air would rise. And as it would rise, it would spread out and then it would set back down. So that we have what we call a Hadley cell, a convection cell, a circulation pattern. So we talked about that in the tropics, the trade winds blow toward the equator. We also talked about they tend to get deflected, so that they get deflected from the east back to the west. We get the opposite pattern once we move into the temperate regions. So temperate regions are the regions of the earth where we experience all four seasons, where there's a cold time that's winter, there's a warm time that's summer, and there's in-between times that are spring and fall. Those occur between 30 and 60 degrees latitude. So when this air is coming back down, some of it that doesn't turn back toward the equator turns toward the poles. As it stays over the ground, it warms up and it rises again at about 60 degrees. Now, about how these cells relate to the climate. When this hot, moist air rises, it cools, it condenses, and that causes lots of rain. So tropical regions tend to be rainy. So this is where we're going to be looking at our rainforest, tropical rainforests. We will also talk about tropical grasslands that are not as rainy, but the rainforests typically are rainy because this hot air rising, it cools and causes precipitation. Now, once the precipitation is dropped, the air is relatively dry. When it comes back down toward the earth, it gets compressed. When it gets compressed, it warms back up, so you have warm, dry air coming back to the earth at about 30 degrees north or south of the equator. Because of that, we're going to see that deserts form at about 30 degrees north or south of the equator. Now, if you remember when we talked about circulation patterns, there's some things that can mitigate this, that can change this, local geography. We talked about that even though South Georgia is about 30 degrees north of the equator, it's anything but a desert. It's in fact very rainy. And we talked about that's largely because this warm, dry air comes down over the Gulf of Mexico, and that actually leads to lots of rain. You get a similar effect in the Indian Ocean and in other places along the way, depending on the direction of the prevailing wind. So the prevailing winds in the tropics, the trade winds, they blow toward the equator and they get deflected from the east to the west. The prevailing winds in the temperate regions blow toward the poles and they get deflected from the west to the east. We call those westerlies. So when that air comes down, that dry air comes down over the Gulf, typically the prevailing wind is carrying it this way and it carries that Gulf moisture into the southeastern United States. That pattern of circulation again reverses when you get to about 60 degrees. As this air rises, some of it also turns toward the pole. So it rains a lot here as it rises, so that's where you tend to get some temperate rainforest. This air comes back down dry, even though the compression tries to warm it, just coming out of the poles, it's still really cold, but you have cold, dry air at the poles, and the wind circulation pattern again reverses. Now, I can show those same circulation patterns in the southern hemisphere. I really just want to go back and refer to them because I'm going to use them to explain where biomes tend to form. Now, one of the major things that affects the weather patterns and the climate are the circulation patterns of the air. There are some other things that also affect the weather patterns and the climate that you need to know to understand kind of where biomes form. So this is related to those weather patterns, the latitude and the altitude. So typically if you start near the equator, 0 degrees latitude is going to be warm. And as you move further away from the equator, it's going to get colder and colder and colder and colder until you get to polar ice. Probably can't see the words here, but you're talking about you have tropical rainforests and you move to the temperate regions and then the taiga, the tundra, and the polar ice. Altitude can also affect that, even if you're near the equator, where it's typically quite warm. If you start to go up high enough mountains, it tends to, if you're on top of really high mountains, even near the equator, it's almost like being at a polar region because those mountainous regions make it colder. So remember we talked about as you go up in the troposphere, the temperature cools. So two things here that affect the climate other than the air circulation is the latitude and the altitude. A third thing that we've already mentioned when we talked about the Gulf, but it can come up in other places, is local geography. So this shows the ocean, and there's a breeze coming off the ocean coming up over some mountains. As that air rises, carrying moisture from the ocean, it condenses, forms rain, so you get a rainy side of the mountain, but after the rain falls out, the air is dry, it tends to come down and get compressed and make it warm back up. So if you have really high mountains near the coast where the wind is coming in, you tend to have a wet side of the mountain and a dry side of the mountain. We call this the rain shadow effect. That is also important in areas where you have big mountain ranges in determining the climate and thus determining the type of biome. Now, let's take a look at some of the individual biomes. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start at the equator and work my way toward the poles. So at the equator, we're in the tropics, between the tropics, those tropical regions, we primarily think of what we call the tropical rainforest. In times past, this was called the jungle. It really is still a jungle that we usually don't refer to it as that. It's kind of been rebranded because tropical rainforest has a nicer. Now, tropical rainforests tend to have great amounts of biodiversity. One, because they're warm, that's good for plants and animals to live, and two, they're rainy, that's good for plants and animals to live. Another reason they have great amounts of biodiversity is that there are many different environments within their environment. So this shows a picture of the tropical rainforest and it's divided it into layers. So anytime we're in a forest biome, the dominant plant is going to be trees. And there are many, many different types of trees in the tropical rainforest. Most of these trees grow quite tall and they grow close together, so they tend to shade out the ground below. So Here we have divided the rainforest into layers. The highest trees that poke out above the other trees, they emerge from the other trees. We call that the emergent layer. The tops, where the tops of most of the big trees are, we call that the canopy. So the canopy has a certain kinds of living things. The emergent layer has different kinds of living things. Below the canopy, before you get to the ground, so below the bulk of the leaves, but we're not yet back to the ground, we call this the understory. And then down below the understory on the ground, we have the forest floor. So within this biome, you get lots of different kinds of living things. Here you have lots of decomposers. You have animals that live on the ground or that can move up into the understory, that can move back and forth. Lots of fungi. You'll see snakes and other things in this region as well. In the understory, you tend to have less living things, but you do have living things growing on the side of the trees, living in the trees. And as you move into the canopy, that's where you're going to have the greatest variety of species in the tropical rainforest. Above the canopy, you have the emergent layer, and you have different species there that can thrive and that can move in that top layer. One term that I do want you to know that is associated with tropical rainforest is the term epiphyte. So an epiphyte is basically a plant that lives on another plant. It's not dependent on being hooked to the ground. A lot of times we think of these as vines. In the jungle, you associate the jungle with vines, things growing on the trees. It doesn't have to be vines. It can be mosses, ferns, any kind of plant that is growing off of another plant. And you'll see a lot of times if you visit the rainforest, or if you look at things in the rainforest, that there are plants growing off the side of these trees that are not trees, but they're not hooked to the ground. They're actually just growing off of the trees. Okay, so tropical rainforests occur in tropical regions. They occur near the equator because it's warm and because it's wet. If we look at that, we can see that on a map. So this map shows the location of tropical rainforests throughout the world. One point of reference you always want to make when you're looking at a map this way is, where is the equator? Where is that principal line of latitude? And some people, without having a globe, have a hard time locating that. The equator goes through Ecuador. It comes through what we call Central Africa. This is going to be the Congo, and over through Indonesia. So if you look here, you'll see major rainforests in those areas. You have the Amazon rainforest, you have the Congo, and you have the Indonesian rainforest. Now, some rainforests can go north or south of there. Madagascar is a little bit south. If we come up into Costa Rica, Central America, we're a little bit north. But we're all in those tropical regions, and there's lots of rain. Now, on all of these slides for the different biomes, I'm going to show you a picture for a sample location. The sample location may be specified, it may not, but it will show you graphs of the temperature versus the month of the year and of the precipitation versus the month of the year. I am not going to actually reference these very much as I go through my presentation. You should have looked at some of these with your Bio Interactive, and you should be able to read these graphs and interpret them, and they may show up as test questions. This first one, just to kind of show you some things that you can see. So if you're looking over here, you can see the months: January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. Okay, now over here in red, this is showing the temperature, and I don't really even want to focus so much on what the temperature is, but I just want you to see that the temperature is very constant throughout the year. Yeah, it's a little bit colder. This must be in the southern hemisphere, but it's a little bit colder in June and July, but not really. It's the same temperature all year round. The other thing is it's relatively rainy all year round. And you may have one season that's a little wetter and one season that's a little bit drier, but it's relatively rainy all year round. Now, again, I'm not going to focus so much on these temperature and rainfall pictures as we go throughout the presentation, but I do want you to know they're there, and I do want you to know you should be able to interpret them. So rainforests, they're wet, they're warm, they have lots of different types of trees, lots of different types of animals. We divide them into different sections: the emergent layer, the canopy, the understory, the forest floor. The second type of biome that I want to look at is also a tropical biome, but it's a tropical biome in areas that are less rainy. It is what we call the tropical grassland. Sometimes it's also called the savanna. So the savanna, most of you have a direct association. You usually think of in Africa, the Serengeti. So you'll see here a picture in Africa, and you'll see the dominant plant is grasses. So again, the type of plant determines the type of biome. Forests are dominated by trees. Grasslands are dominated by grasses. Now, grasslands can also have trees. There's a couple of reasons that trees do not dominate in grasslands. The main one is that they typically do not get enough rain. Trees require lots of rainfall, and if you don't have enough rainfall, you can't support a forest. In Africa, there are other reasons that can sometimes that keep these trees from taking over the grassland. There are lots of large animals that feed on these trees, particularly the elephants, and they tend to keep the trees from taking over the grassland. But the main reason is that there's not enough rainfall. It's not a rainforest. It's not rainy enough. You also have savanna areas in other parts of the world, like the Pampas in South America. So again, a tropical grassland. So I want you to see the location of that. So again, we're in tropical regions. Try to get yourself familiarized with the equator in. I'm a little bit off on my picture there with the equator. But same idea, so we're still in the tropics. These tend to occur, though, in areas where there's less rainfall. There's reasons for there being less rainfall. So when we were looking, what happens here in this part of Africa is you move away from the coast, a lot of the rainfall falls here in the jungle, and when the air masses move over here, it's drier. You get similar effects in other places, but you have still have warm temperatures year round, but you don't have as much rainfall, so it's drier, and that makes the grasses dominate rather than the trees. So the next biome we're going to look at are deserts. Now, I mentioned earlier that deserts usually occur about 30 degrees away from the equator, 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south. And we talked about why those deserts tend to occur there. 30 degrees north or south of the equator because when the air from the tropics comes back down, it's dry and it gets compressed, and that makes it hot. We talked about local geography could change that. Most of us associate deserts with open sandy places. They don't all look like that, and it depends from time to time on how much rain they've had recently, how they look. Most of us also think of deserts as hot, but deserts tend to be places of extreme swings in temperature. Having moisture in the air, having clouds in the air can kind of trap heat so that it doesn't cool off as much at night or warm up as much during the day. So the presence of cloud tends to moderate temperatures. In deserts, it's often scorchingly hot during the day, but during the evening, it drops quite cool, even cold. Also, different deserts are at different elevations and different latitudes. There are some deserts that are colder than others. One thing that I want to mention with deserts is desert plants. Desert plants, as plants in all areas, they're adapted to their area. They need special adaptations to live in dry regions. And most of you, when you think of desert plants, you probably think of cacti. The American Southwest, there are many different types of cacti. There are lots of cactuses, okay? But other deserts throughout the world, they don't have cacti. They still have plants that are designed that fit and can live there. I want to look at just a couple of those. So one type of desert plant is called succulents. Succulents tend to have thick skin, and they tend to have a waxy coating to keep from losing water. You won't be able to see all these pictures really well, but there are lots of different types of succulents. Some of them you may have heard of, like the agave or the aloe. So you know an aloe has that moisture inside, that hollow tube, and it has that thick, waxy skin. Of course, there are also cacti, those you are familiar with, that are associated. Again, they tend to have hollow stems. They have needles in order to preserve moisture. They don't have a lot of surface area for their volume. Other types of desert plants, these are called hedgehog. They often look like they are kinds of cacti. But another thing that is associated with deserts that you may not think of are wildflowers. And you don't really think of wildflowers as being in deserts, because most of the time the desert is too dry. But one of the amazing things about wildflowers is after they flower and they drop their seeds can lie dormant until it rains. And when deserts do get rain, you often see a big bloom of wildflowers that come up right after. It's short-lived because the desert gets dry and the flowers die off, and then they leave their seeds behind to come back later. You can also have trees, shrubs, and grasses. A lot of you think of the tumbleweed when you associate things with the desert. Now, I want to look again at the location of the deserts. We talked a little bit about those. But trying to get you to be able to locate where things are likely to be in the world. So again, we're going to get our reference point with the equator. So about 30 degrees north of the equator, we have lots of deserts. So you see over here, desert in the American Southwest, northern Mexico, moving over into the Sahara, to the Arabian Desert. And about 30 degrees south, you have desert in Australia, you have desert in South Africa, and you have desert in South America. Again, they all tend to fall about those 30 degrees. Some are a little further north, some are a little further south, but they tend to fall in those areas. Another thing that you will see, though, some of these deserts tend to fall behind mountain ranges. The Atacama Desert here in South America is behind the Andes. So it gets even less rain than most. It's the driest desert in the world. It happens to be at the right latitude for desert formation, or at least part of it is, and it's behind these big mountains, so it gets that rain shadow effect, super dry. Deserts, depending on where they are, they can have a big range of temperatures throughout the year, or they can, they're almost in that temperate region, but the key thing is that they are dry year-round. They are dry year-round. So now that we've looked at all of the tropical regions, I want to look at the temperate regions. So in the temperate regions, we're looking from 30 degrees to 60 degrees north or south of the equator. They're called temperate regions because they have the seasons. They have all 4 seasons in a distinct form. So winter, spring, summer, fall. One that you probably are less familiar with is called the chaparral. Chaparral, also sometimes called the Mediterranean climate. The Mediterranean falls in the chaparral. It's relatively dry, low humidity most of the year, but they do tend to have a rainy season, and they tend to have enough rain that they can support shrubs. Okay, they're not going to be able to support a forest. Generally don't have lots of big trees, but they do tend to have shrubs. So you can kind of see that in the picture. One area that would be easy for you to identify this with is in the western United States, Hollywood, LA. So when you look at those Hollywood hills, they have shrubs, and to us it almost looks like a desert when we're used to living in a forest, but it's not the desert, it is the chaparral. Now, this is, relatively speaking, a much smaller biome in terms of the land area occupied. Notice it is all around the Mediterranean, what's sometimes called the Mediterranean climate. California, northern Mexico, Baja California. You also see a little in central Chile, South Africa, and the southern part of Australia, especially the southeast and the west. Okay, so temperatures can vary from season to season. We are in a temperate region, so it tends to be colder in January and February and warmer in June, July, and August. So you're going to see some variation in seasonal temperature. We are moving into those temperate zones, and you'll see that the rainfall is also very seasonal. It tends to have relatively dry summers and wetter winter. Now, that wetness compared to the wetness of the rainforest, still not nearly as much, but still there are certain seasons when they do get rainfall. Staying with the temperate regions, the one that you should be the most familiar with is the temperate deciduous forest. We live in a temperate deciduous forest. You may not see here, but this picture was taken by UGA, and it looks like fall. You can see the beginning of the seasons. Again, anytime it's a forest biome, the dominant species is trees, and any forest biome tends to be relatively wet. Okay, we're not going to be as wet as the rainforest, but the southeastern United States, in terms of total rainfall, is one of the rainiest places in the country. Okay, it doesn't rain as many days as it does in Hawaii or perhaps Seattle, but the overall rainfall tends to be more. We tend to have lots of heavy rains from our tropical storm systems. Again, you can see a picture. There tends to be less biodiversity in the temperate deciduous forest than in the tropical rainforest, primarily because it's not as warm. Trees, but whereas we may have 15, 20 types of trees that dominate our forests, the tropical forest may have hundreds of types of trees. They tend to have more types of trees, and therefore they tend to have more types of other living things. Temperate deciduous forest, most of you again are familiar with. You live in one. Covers large parts of the earth. So if you look at a map of the temperate deciduous forest, you can see almost all of the eastern United States and large parts of the western United States, almost all of Europe, and in large parts of China over to Korea, Japan, and Australia, and the southern part of South America is a temperate forest. Again, it's temperate, so you'll notice you'll see a big variation in temperature from winter to summer. This was for Staunton, Virginia, but you can see a big swing in temperature. And there may be some seasons that are rainier than others, but you tend to get a fair amount of rainfall throughout. That's why we can support trees. Now, deciduous trees are those trees that lose their leaves in the fall and going into the winter. You don't really see that so much in the tropics. Why do the trees lose their leaves in these temperate regions? Well, it gets cold enough in the wintertime that it can freeze them. And leaves on the deciduous trees are broad and flat, so they don't have a lot of volume, they have a lot of surface area, so it's very easy for them to freeze. So if they kept their leaves throughout, they would freeze and that would damage the plant, so they lose their leaves going into the seasons. The next temperate biome that I want to look at is the temperate grassland. So again, it's temperate, it has different seasons. Obviously, the dominant plant is grass. You might think of the Great Plains with the buffalo. You may think of the steppes in Mongolia and Central Asia. There are lots of different places where you have temperate grassland throughout the world. Tend to be lower on biodiversity because there's less rainfall, but there's still lots of things there and many unique and wonderful things in the temperate grassland. So let's look at where they're located throughout the world and talk about their weather. So temperate grasslands, again, are in the temperate regions, 30 to 60 degrees north or south of the equator, where you have all the seasons. So you see that in the variation in temperature. They tend to get some rainfall, enough to support grasses, but not enough to make the whole thing a forest. Again, there can be other things that help to keep it there. But if you're looking there, you got the Great Plains, you got the steppes, okay? There are other regions that tend to be grasses. So far, we have covered our tropical biomes, the tropical rainforest and the savanna. We've covered our temperate biomes, the chaparral, the temperate forest, and the temperate grassland. And we talked about in between, we have those deserts. So now we're going to move further north. So we're going to move into our northern biomes. The first one we're going to look at is a forest. So in these northern biomes, the forest that we look at is sometimes called the taiga. You'll hear that term. I want you to know the term taiga. Sometimes more descriptively, it's also called the coniferous forest because the forest is made of conifers, these cone-bearing trees. Sometimes it's also called the boreal forest. Boreal means northern, and you're going to see that all these are in the northern parts of the world. A lot of times we associate them with Christmas trees. Why is this biome dominated by this kind of tree? Well, there's enough rainfall to support trees, but it gets really cold, as you can see here by the picture. And with the shape of these trees, that allows them to sometimes shed the snow, not break under their weight. And perhaps more importantly, they're designed in a way that they don't easily freeze. Instead of having broad, there's more volume and less surface area. It's harder to freeze. Those needles also tend to have a waxy covering that tend to insulate them from their environment. So you're going to find these in northern parts of the world. So in the US, you start getting up into Maine, moving into Canada. In Europe, you start getting up into Scandinavia and northern Russia. You're going to move into these areas. So you can see here by their location throughout the world, why it's sometimes called the northern forest. You don't really have any in the southern hemisphere, because by the time you get to that latitude, there's not any land there until you get to Antarctica, and then it's too cold. So much of Canada, some of the more northerly part of the 48 contiguous states, Scandinavia, Russia, you get this coniferous forest. Again, they're going to have enough rainfall in order to support trees, and you're going to notice that while there's still seasonal variation in temperature, it tends to be much, much colder and relatively cold year-round. So here we're looking at temperatures down to minus 20 to 15 Celsius, so we're looking at relatively cold temperatures all year round, not really a temperate region. So you really have more of a winter and then maybe a very brief summer. Okay, you may not even notice the spring or the fall. Lots of cold. If we go above that, the last biome that I'm going to talk about here is talk about polar ice. But the last one that I'm going to discuss with you is tundra. So tundra occurs in those extreme areas where it's frozen. Parts of the ground stay frozen all year long. We call that the permafrost. That permafrost helps inhibit trees, so that's one reason that trees don't grow there. They can't really get through the ice. But the main reason that you don't have trees there is because they would freeze. In fact, even most grasses would freeze. So grasses that grow there tend to be very short and stay close to the ground because the ground, in a sense, warms them. It absorbs the sunlight, keeps them out of the wind. So lots of the year may be completely frozen. This is probably actually even coming into spring. You're seeing some spring melt, but in that spring, you tend to get a flowering and you get lots of flowers and short grasses and things that grow. Also, one thing that surprises people, there are lots of insects in the tundra during the summer. So in Alaska, parts of Alaska that are tundra, during the summertime melt, there's lots of big mosquitoes, lots of bugs. And the reason is you get all this moisture on the ground, and it can't soak into the ground because the ground below it's frozen, so that moisture just stays on top, and it acts as an ideal breeding place for bugs. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what I want you to know about the different biomes. So know where they're located on Earth. Know that it's the climate that determines the type of biome, though we distinguish the type of biome primarily by their dominant plant. Forests are dominated by trees, grasslands are dominated by grasses, desert have few plants, and when they do, they're very distinct desert plants, and the chaparral is dominated by shrubs.